Panel 4, Freedom and Victory. When this war started, the US and many predicted that Ukraine would fall in 3 to 10 days. That's what many in Russia and the West seem to think. Now Russia has the 3rd or 4th best army in Ukraine, I lose track of which it is, and it's staring down the barrel of a gun to defeat. What counts as a sustainable victory for Ukraine? I'm delighted to be joined on stage by Danylchuk, YouTuber, academic, who's been running a war diary since the start of the war. If you're not watching it, where have you been for the last year and a half? Next, I'm joined by the extraordinary Olena Halushka. She's a board member of the Ukrainian NGO Anti-Corruption Action Center and co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. She's an extraordinary activist. And I know you're absolutely going to love everything she says. And finally, we've got Joe Lindsley, Daily Ukraine correspondent for WGN Radio. Joe's a traveler and writer. And I know I'm going to become an avid fan of his work. I'm going to binge all of your stuff when I get back home. Well, let's launch into it. If you guys shuffle along one, and then for the sake of the cameras, it won't look like I'm allergic or something like that. Let's start with a heavy topic, because there was a NATO summit. There was also a NAFO summit in parallel, so mention of the NATO fellas out there. There was a NATO summit and there were high hopes of that. But what we see here is a continuation of the incremental supply, incrementalism. And whereas that might make some strategic sense, it's enormously costly in terms of time and Ukrainian lives. So could we please address this idea of incrementalism and why it has to end?
Thank you so much. I was observing the very process of the NATO forum. I had my dreams concerning that, realizing that at the moment Ukraine cannot join NATO, but perhaps we should make our relations more official. And for many Ukrainians, deadline, a roadmap is something that they really need to make it more realistic. And at the same time, remembering myself in February 2022, just before the start of full-scale Russian invasion, I did not believe it was possible. There were lots of articles, lots of highly respected people all over the world speaking, shouting, screaming about that. But I have consciously chosen the articles that persuaded it's irrational, it's illogical. It is. It is. But Russia is irrational and illogical. My beautiful subscribers, greetings to them if they will be watching, and they will be, told me there is a term, a psychological term, which explains it all. And that is normalcy bias. When, from your cognitive perspective of a normal human being, you cannot predict such evil exists. You cannot predict such war is possible after so many lessons that we've learned in the 20th century. And many nations who are still far away from the epicenter of things that are happening right now in Ukraine still believe we can return back to normal and that this previous kind of normal is possible. But global security system demonstrated lots of flaws. We did not manage to prevent this war because Russia is irrational, illogical, and monstrous at the moment. People are kind and they want to believe it's something wrong, it's something different. There are good Russians who will protest. There are things that they will be able to stop. But no, we have to accept that this is pure evil, modern Nazism that is targeted at the destruction of culture, language, children, hospitals, everything. That's why we have to be also violent, because Russia is a global bully that probes the world, and if it sees no reaction, it escalates. I personally hate the advice, let's not escalate. A victim I don't like naming Ukraine a victim, but still, a victim cannot escalate. It is only the aggressor. And we constantly see that. Russia threatens Ukraine and does what it promises. Russia threatens the world, and they say, we will nuke London, and what reaction we hear? We will look into Arctic and so on. Monsters, maniacs like Russia, they don't understand normal reasoning. That's why they only understand when we are able to stop their missiles or target some of their military bases, supplies in Crimea and possibly, potentially in future on Russian territory. And I think that, summing it all up, global community has to finally agree that if we are supporting Ukraine, it's not about you are giving 5 planes, then I'm giving 3 jets. If you're not giving, I'm not giving. It's about an existential fight, future and security of the planet. So as long as it takes and as much as it takes, we're giving. Because think how many lives would have been saved if we had a similar air defense system as we do now in Kyiv back last autumn. How many people died because of these delays, arguments, and we wouldn't have blackouts. And blackouts is not just about darkness in your flats. It's about hospitals. It's about lots of opportunities lost. So if we all see that Russia is evil and we have to support Ukraine that fights against this evil for the sake of the world, then let's not just like count and if you're giving 3, I'm giving 5. It's about an existential fight.
Well, I will actually catch up on what Anna said, and I think that the key problem is that there is no consensus that Ukraine should win this war. And as we all know, the goal defines the means. So the goal of the West as of now is to support Ukrainian survival, to make sure that Ukraine doesn't fall and is not taken over by Russia. And basically that's it. And the problem is that you know, this war cannot be seen isolated. If you take a look at the Russian behavior over the last decades, I mean, 2 most bloodiest war, except current genocide and war crimes in Syria, were in Chechnya, in the era which was considered super liberal in Russia and super democratic, and very many people thought that, hey, after the USSR collapsed, we will have finally democratic Russia on the map. And nobody basically, you know, cared about slaughtering of Chechen people, about their genocide, because everybody was happy with an excuse that they are terrorists, you know, and even if we speak about those terrorist acts that were staged and used as the false flag. Basically, that's the modus operandi which Russia is currently using in Ukraine. So the biggest issue which I see, and this is what the countries that are unlucky to share border with Russia understand very well, like Baltic states or Central Eastern European states and Scandinavian countries understand very well that unpunished evil grows and multiplies. And if we do not make the full stop of Russian acts of aggression now, and this is not only full Ukrainian victory, but also accountability, reparations, and restoration of Ukraine's control over entire territory, including Crimea. Crimea is the same Ukrainian territory as Lviv or Kiev or anything else. Why this territory should be disputed? So all those, when we have the general consensus that Ukraine should win this war because that would be beneficial to everybody, not only Ukrainians, then it won't be 3 planes here and 5 tanks there. It will be, the assistance similar to the scale which we had in the World War II, which was hundreds of items monthly.
I'll just add to that, because I think there's an important point here. And as has been mentioned before, and the audience groaned, I was in St. Petersburg at that time, in the 90s, when that war was unfolding. And when Yeltsin was going for re-election, and it looked like he was going to lose against the communists, and the West backed Yeltsin to the hilt because they believed he was liberal. And not only did they back him with media support, they sent PR experts, they sent campaign experts, people like Steve Bannon, to hack the electoral system. So we went against our principles to back the guy that we thought was most like us. And in the process, I think we created the foundations for what's happening now. And we also think of Russia as only being aggressive against its neighbors. It's also aggressive against its own people. And way before Putin, I was in the St. Petersburg metro during the conscription, where people who weren't at university, who were of conscription age, were trying to hide, living out on their dachas and whatever, not to be conscripted. And we're in the metro, one of the deep metro stations. The train pulls in and they closed off all of the exits and then checked everyone's papers. And if you didn't have a military service paper, if you couldn't explain why you weren't in university or in the army, they would take you straight off to the sort of frontline training centers, whip you straight out of civilian life, no questions, off you go. This is long before Putin. This is not just Putin who's created this system of terror. So I thought I have to share that, because what's unfolding now is no surprise to me, having seen what I saw there in the 90s.
Well, thank you for that. Dobry den, меня зовут Yosef. I'm Joe, American, and I've been in Ukraine nonstop since the pandemic. I came here to give a talk at the Catholic University here in Lviv. The borders closed, and I realized this is going to be the freest country in the world, which it was during the pandemic. And as an American, I love that freedom. And I think so many Americans that have come here in this time, they feel freer here and happier here, even in the time of war, than they do in, say, Chicago or Los Angeles or Philadelphia. And what I got to see during that time of the pandemic was Ukraine, the post-Maidan Ukraine, the Ukraine that was flourishing, the Ukraine that, because of Russian propaganda, we don't hear about in America. And if you look at the BBC and all the mainstream media, they do a great job, and very brave reporters, of talking about Russian atrocities. But what they miss is the story of the Maidan Ukraine, the real democratic Ukraine. We still hear the Russian narrative about corruption, when Russia is in fact the most corrupt country in the world. No country that was corrupt could have survived those first days and weeks of the full-scale invasion. It was people like everyone here, the regular citizens, who enabled Ukraine to hold on. And so I saw that during the time of the pandemic, this strength. And I was actually on American media a lot 2 weeks before the full-scale invasion. But when I was on American media, everyone thought I was crazy in the first 2 weeks before the big invasion. And then afterward, one radio station in Chicago called me up. They had me on Chicago's WGN. And they said, last week on February 24th, during your broadcast, we said, we can't have this guy on anymore. He's crazy. He said, Ukraine's not going to lose in 3 days or 3 weeks. And the next week they called me and said, we're going to have you on every day because you were the only one who was right. You knew the truth, and only because I had been here. And so since then, it's kind of extraordinary to consider for me, but every single weekday, Monday through Friday, without a break, I've got 10 minutes on Chicago WGN radio. And we have a very loyal audience there, and even if sometimes the commercial goes long and we're 1 minute late, and people start texting the station to make sure I'm still alive, and because I've been traveling through the country. And so we created, along with this project, we created UkrainianFreedomNews.com. Thanks to one of our donors, Tom, who's helping make this possible today. Tom from Atlanta, Georgia. And what we started to do is to connect the most effective volunteers throughout Ukraine and people in the States. And we work on supplying soldiers in the front lines, as every single person here does. But my main focus is the information war, because, and just a quick summary of it, I used to work for Fox News. I knew Tucker Carlson. I call him by a different name if I'm not on microphone. And I knew these people. I was protege to Roger Ailes of Fox News. I escaped Rupert Murdoch's empire in a car chase. They made a movie about it with Russell Crowe playing my boss. Some other guy played me. That's why I came to Ukraine. It was a peaceful way to get away from all this craziness. And now the craziness is here. And I realized this is my mission in two ways: to reach Americans, because I came from that world of Americans who talk about freedom every day, but so many of them believe the Russian propaganda. And part of this is because the foreign media, and my friend Taras, who's here with Tvoye Misto, you did such a good job at the beginning, the first few months, explaining to foreign reporters what Ukraine is, but they still don't really deeply understand this idea of Ukrainian democracy, which is so fierce and true. And so if more Americans knew that story, the same Americans that follow Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, these are the people who, if they even came here for a day, they would say, this is my favorite country in the world. And so there we have an information barrier. So now I share it with my Chicago audience every single day, but that's only in the Midwest, and they're already pretty loyal. And so the dream and the goal now is to break through these silos and to reach people, say, in Austin, Texas. We have some Austinites here today, by the way. And to really share the positive story of what Ukraine is, not just the Russian atrocities, but why Ukraine, Americans are, often they complain, like, why is Ukraine getting so much money? And by the way, those numbers are inflated. It's a cost of old equipment that, really is what that 100 billion is. But they look at their lives in cities like San Francisco and Chicago with high murder rates and everything's difficult, and they see scenes of Kyiv and Lviv where everything's lovely, and what they miss is, like, they could have a life like this. And what I want to do is change the narrative, so not only are we helping Ukraine, but we're actually, in this moment, inspired by how Ukrainians live. Think of the Joe Rogan podcast. He's always talking about how every day, start your morning with an ice bath. Come to Ukraine, you don't need an ice bath. You got a missile bath, if you're in certain cities, and like, this is the edge this is the center of human excellence. And so my mission in storytelling is to get people to realize that. And I saw early on, after about a month of these daily broadcasts, maybe April 2022, I realized that if I simply reported, on the atrocities, people were going to get bored, because it's just the same. Russia knows this. The same news repeated over and over. People are going to get bored. So I really had to dig deep and travel the country and share. I want people who listen to my broadcast to feel like they're here. And I'm mindful that a lot of them are driving to work, so I don't want to freak them out too much, but I want them, they write to the station, like they were crying this morning. I'm good, they should feel that, and really feel it. Someone said the idea in the previous panel, empathy versus empire, and that's the strength. We have that potential, and all we have to do is kind of break some silos, and that's why it's great we have so many different people here today to start finding ways to be more effective. The fact that many Ukrainians don't know NAFO. NAFO does so much for Ukraine, North Atlantic Fellows Organization on Twitter, but many people here don't know what it is, and even including very effective Ukrainian volunteers. And so my mission is to help break these walls and bring us more in a more united fashion, and using great Ukrainian creativity to share this message on why not only Ukraine should be defended, but why Western democracies should look to Ukraine as an example on how to live.
Now, the next question, I think, is quite a hard one. It's quite a concerning one as well for those that are testing the temperature of sort of global opinion, but especially in the US and other places as well. And that's the idea that Western support comes with a best before date. We've got US elections coming up. We've got great uncertainty. We've got many of the things there which Joe mentioned, which is concern about how much money is being spent, etc. I don't think that's valid, but it's something that a lot of people are discussing. And of course, we've got the potential for another winter. We know that Russia weaponizes fuel, it weaponizes coal, it weaponizes food. And the Western media are impatient. You had the same thing in World War II. Oh, why is this normally landing thing taking so long? You compare the newspapers in 1944 and you get the same headlines. Why is it all so slow? Because it's big and it's a big war and it takes time and you're not military experts, so shut up. But there is this concern here of the best before date on Western support. And Ukraine needs more, not less. So let's tackle that. Is it a real thing? Is it a real concern? And what can be done about it? Anna.
It's difficult to be first, but, well, I think I often, in such discussions, I often offer people, imagine the world where Russia wins this war. That is the most sobering experience. Don't focus on minor things, but imagine the world where Russia takes over Ukraine. And it will not stop in Ukraine, for sure. It will continue. And also, it will inspire other authoritarian regimes that are very closely observing what is happening. And for me, it is an offense that in so many countries, Putin is still treated as a political figure, not a criminal figure. And he is still negotiated with. I wouldn't like to live in the world where Russia wins, because after seeing so many crimes, witnessing genocide in Ukraine and in other countries, we've seen, and I love this phrase, that unpunished evil grows. From Russia, we see it for the last 300 centuries. Actually, I'm super happy about how strong Ukraine turned out to be, that we survived all of these centuries. But many, many nations are suffering from Russia. Chechnya, Georgia, and they are also very dangerous because they don't care about things happening inside Russia. I'm sorry, but their people are used to live in misery and they don't care about, hatred is something that fuels them instead of food, normalcy, travels, and other. And they also fuel different conflicts all over the world, interfere into elections. They are very carefully observing what is happening in each country to distract these countries from the support they give to Ukraine. Russian narrative is still strong. They've got lots of platforms, starting from YouTube. There are many more Russian vloggers, and you pretty well know that, and they have millions, and they use it for soft Russian propaganda. Also, they are very dangerous because the messages, the propaganda messages that they use differ greatly depending on the country they target. Of course, they do not spread something totally stupid as that they do inside Russia, and they are very cunning to find the messages that can terrify European supporters, North American supporters. But I guess this vision of the world where Russia wins, China is inspired by that, and evil prevails, nobody will want to live. So we have to concentrate all of our efforts and to finish it sooner. And to finish it sooner with total collapse of Russia. And I think apart from this really terrifying images, we have to start constructing some positive images of, I don't know, many new countries appearing on the territory of Russian Federation and dynamic countries open for investment, I don't know, cooperation and other stuff. So balancing in between.
And if people can't imagine what a Russian victory looks like, there's a rather good book by George Orwell, which I think reflects that reality.
So indeed, that is a very big question, how to maintain the support. But we are extremely grateful to Western taxpayers for all of the assistance which we have already received. But this is absolutely not a sustainable thing to condition our existential survival as the nation on somebody's, pre-electoral moods, their political debates, Ukraine, being played as the ball in the football between different political parties in the elections. This is not the way how, basically the assistance for the victory should be allocated. That is why for us it is incredibly important, and we, together with my center, International Center for Ukrainian Victory, we will promote the campaign to confiscate Russian assets, particularly the sovereign assets of the Russian Central Bank. Right now, Western countries immobilized $350 billion. This is approximately, that would cover half of the damages. And these are just the damages which Ukrainian government has calculated. So this does not regard what is in the occupied territories, what Russia will destroy while they will be forced for a goodwill gesture from the other currently occupied territories. This does not include the damages caused by the Kakhovka Dam explosion, so the number will only grow. We heard a lot that it's impossible, you know, it's a kind of, I don't know, untouchable thing. If you violate the sovereign immunity today, tomorrow, you know, I don't know, African countries will start confiscating Western assets, whatever. I have no idea, you know, but people who are opposing this idea, they are making up a lot of different arguments. But the thing is that this is not a legal argument. This is a political argument. And if the lawyers are asked how to confiscate these assets, they will offer a number of solutions. And I have seen already different ways and mechanisms how this could be done absolutely legally without creating a dangerous precedent and without threatening the third countries, so they will withdraw their assets from the Western banking systems and refocus them, let's say, to China or North Korea. I don't know where they would want to end up their central bank's money. So it's incredibly important to make sure that we have a kind of, you know, a reserve, untouchable one, which won't be the politically influenced, but like a kind of a guaranteed money. And the last point which I would like to make here, we used this as an argument when we advocated for the invitation of Ukraine to NATO at the Vilnius summit, and it was that this is the cheapest option to ensure security in Europe, because businesses will definitely want to go and invest in Ukraine's recovery, and government also want to do this. And that's definitely the priority of the German government, French, Dutch, American, whatever, because it's very fair that those countries that help us win, survive, win, make money on Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. But those companies which would consider investing, they would need sustainable guarantees, because nobody will bring their money here to Ukraine if in 3 to 5 years Russian missile you know, will land in their factory, plant, object, whatever, destroy it and kill their employees. You know, so one option is to introduce the multi-billion, trillion insurance funds to make sure that all of the damages and costs would be covered in case of the restarted third hot phase of the war. But NATO membership is much cheaper. Comparing, you know, to covering all of Ukraine, which is huge territory with Patriot defense systems or IRIS-T or some PT systems, or NATO membership. It is much, much cheaper. Israeli model, which we are very often hearing about. I mean, will the West accept Ukraine developing our own nukes and protecting us this way? I'm not sure, but this is one of the fundamental guarantees. So when we are hearing, you know, about a lot of different options except the simplest and the cheapest, which is NATO membership, we just realized that, you know, this is how to basically introduce a kind of, I don't know, simulation and not a real security guarantee.
I completely agree on this, and I think, you know, I mean, when I look at the situation in the United States, we're losing the information war. And I keep trying to remind all my Ukrainian friends that even people I know well are getting bored or tired of it. Okay, not excusable, but it's just a fact. And one thing, so we got to find smarter ways to push back at the information level. And one simple fact, we hear that the United States has spent more than $100 billion on Ukraine, but if you look closely at those numbers, and there's a few people that have begun to pay attention to this, most of that, almost all the military aid in that figure, so now it's almost 20 billion for direct military aid, is evaluation of old equipment that has been sent to Ukraine. And then within these aid packages is new equipment for the United States, equipment that we were going to buy anyway. And in the ways of Washington, where I worked, and I started my career working for the people that started the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I worked at the Weekly Standard magazine, and I know how they work. They shove everything. They know Ukraine is sort of popular now. It was more popular a year ago. And they shove these expenditures into the Ukraine bills. And the people here, our friends who are losing life and limb, either in the front lines or in Ukrainian cities, are paying the price for the Washington games. So what we got to do is wake people up. And just to simply understand, it has not been that expensive. The second part of this is Russia has convinced many in America that Russia is what Ukraine actually is. Ukraine is everything I've seen about this country, especially now since the full-scale invasion, but even before and since Maidan, Ukraine is a country of family values, of strong culture, of tradition, but also innovation and tolerance. Ukraine is, it's quite an ideal place. And it's every American I know who comes here, as I mentioned, whether it was a Harvard professor or Afghanistan veterans, they all agree they want to stay here. And so we have to punch back against this because so many people believe, they've heard so often in the media, the favorite adjectives in most news stories for Ukraine are beleaguered and corrupt, words that we never see with Russia. And so we everyone on the Ukrainian side, we need to think more. And because I look so much at Ukrainian media, and there's a big unawareness in Ukrainian media and Ukrainian government of just how much quickly we're losing the information war in the United States. And I think one thing that could help solve this is getting more Ukrainian voices in English to speak to Americans, to speak to Westerners. Too often right now, it's only the politicians. In fact, there was a member of your parliament who had dinner with some friends of mine in Arizona and a bunch of Republican millionaires. Very nice guy, but I wish there had been some people in this room who are very dynamic and could really share. The people I know in Ukraine who my American friends would say, wow, I love these people. That's what we have to show to the West. And we really can't take for granted, it's like, we can't take for granted that everyone understands us. Their lives are busy, but if you think about this, Americans love superhero movies. We're the ones that make Top Gun and all that stuff. And we watch it because we get good emotions out of it. But the real fight, the real superhero movie is happening here every single day. We love self-help books. The real self-help book is here every single day. And if we could convince Americans, like, hey, every time you watch a superhero movie or Lord of the Rings or whatever, like, think about, you don't just have to sit on your couch. You can find purpose in your life simply by voting for Ukraine or donating in some way. And I think with a more orchestrated and coordinated campaign, we can reach these people. And so we have to reach people at the high level, like person-to-person connections, and then on the big, broad, to reach the public audience. And this is because every American expert I know and people at the Pentagon and others, they told me back maybe say in February that if Ukraine does not do something extraordinary by the end of this summer, there's going to be new pressure to negotiate, to have a partition line. This is coming. It's coming quickly. And so we must, and that's why I'm so glad we have all these people here in this room. We need rapidly to figure out how to change the narrative on it because we're losing very quickly the information war.
So I want to pack 3 questions in. 2 are quite related. So I'm going to lump 2 questions in together and then save the big question till last. The 2 I want to lump in together are, I would say, a strategic misconception. The first one, does chaos and collapse in Russia serve Ukraine's strategic interests? And tied to that question very much is the West's perception of how Ukraine is armed. So is the West more afraid of a Russian defeat than Ukrainian victory? Now, those might seem like separate questions. I think they're intimately connected. This one, whoever wants to take it first.
There was Henry Kissinger, who was President Nixon's Secretary of State. He's still going. He's 100 years old. I used to go to Yankee games with him, and these people for so long have managed our affairs. Henry Kissinger had a story in the Spectator magazine last December saying that the world needs Moscow in the global equilibrium. And this is true of everyone I know, most people I know in Washington. They just can't imagine a world without a powerful Moscow. And this is where the story of the Maidan is so important. So Ukrainians have shown the world that people can have agency. And we just don't believe that in the West. We feel so helpless. You look at all there's a lot of angst in America on the left and the right. And for several years, it's been building up. And people feel helpless. But we live disconnected lives in the West. We don't know how to reach each other. We can never have a Maidan where after the revolution, you had 3 weeks, I think, with no police and very little crime. This is unfathomable to us. And so, but we don't even know this story, and it sounds like it's not even real. And so this goes down to the level of your regular American, but also to high-level people. And friends of mine who used to, check in and try to support, again, people from the Pentagon who cared the first few months of this full-scale invasion, they don't even want to talk about it anymore. They put their heads in the sand. And they just can't, they don't have the imagination to believe that there can be a world without a powerful Moscow. And it's the same, what's interesting, so many of these Americans, they love the protests of the Ottawa truckers against Justin Trudeau's coronavirus restrictions. The Ottawa truckers went home when Trudeau seized their bank accounts. Ukrainians stayed in the Maidan even in the face of bullets. Ukrainians stay in Zaporizhia and Kharkiv in the face of missiles. But this story is being totally missed. And this is what we have to show people. Yes, it is possible. It takes a lot of work, but don't worry too much because the Ukrainians are the ones willing to do the fighting. People are scared of the nuclear question. I mean, Putin knows what he's doing. And as John Sweeney and others were saying, and Taras was saying, Putin's so afraid of death. And he works to scare the West. And I've long believed the closer we get to victory, the more Putin is panicked, he's going to try to scare people. No one thought he was going to bomb the center of Odessa, let alone a Russian Orthodox church. That is a sign of Russia's weakness. And what we have to do is convince the West, it's going to get very, very difficult as we get closer to victory. That means it's working. Ukrainians have stood this long, and we have to convince people to be strong in that. I think one of the very best ways now is simply to bring people here. We have some Americans that bravely came here. Their parents, my friend Lindsley, her parents don't know she's here. So, but when people come here, they see. My friend Rich, who works at the Frontline Kitchen, which every day produces 20,000 meals for frontline soldiers. At your kitchen every day, and I go there whenever I'm depressed, it's here in Lviv, you have people from all over the world, Germany, Ohio, New Hampshire, Japan, every country you can imagine, Colombia, that show up to make food for the soldiers. And when Lviv was hit, I think it was June, by the 3 Shahed suicide drones, Russian-Iranian drones, I mean, that was the first time for many of those volunteers, and that you have young people and you have grandparents that just came here to Ukraine. That was the first time they felt the war. And remember, because we used to be able to shoot those down from far away. Now we had to wait till they got close to Lviv, and you could hear the machine gun fire. And it was terrifying. And a few hours later, I go to the Frontline Kitchen, and everyone was there chopping vegetables, making borscht, making food for the frontline soldiers. A little bit shaken, underslept, but undeterred. And if we could just have that type of courage in Washington, and simply start to convince a few people, that's why I think it has to be through storytelling. We need, because Washington is going to follow what the people say. The only reason the Biden administration really supported Ukraine, the West was quiet the first 3 or 4 days of the full-scale invasion. In fact, the American embassy left Kyiv, it was in early February. We held on more stridently in Kabul and Saigon than we did here. Our departure 3 weeks before the full-scale invasion was an invitation to Russia. And I know from the people I know in Washington, they were just hoping Ukraine would fall and this mess would go away. That's what they do. They're not leaders. So our best bet is to convince the people, the American people in my case, and that's why I look at the podcasters like Joe Rogan and all that. We don't start with them, but there's a lot of middle-level podcasters where we can start to convince these people, get Ukrainians on these shows to share these stories of strength and amazing courage, just to get people inspired the same way they are with a movie. And then we can start to reach the more influential people. It's a big strategy, but we got to move fast and do it because I know Ukrainians will never give up. But as we all know, if we just had a bit more of support, and the key question is, the West and Washington and Brussels and Berlin and London, they need to define what victory is. And that needs to include taking Crimea and the collapse of the Russian Federation. Without that, this doesn't end. That's what we have to convince them.
If you can get Olena and Anna onto Joe Rogan, then that'll be a good step. Yeah.
Well, actually, I have a very short answer to your question. Indeed, the West is afraid of the dissolution of Russia because the Russian nukes will end up in hell knows whose hands. But wait a moment. Russian nukes are already in Belarus, in hell knows whose hands, and everybody is okay with that.
If there is one thing that Russia was and is good at, that was creating myths. And for centuries, they were working on this image of invincible, really strong Russia that no one can understand, but no one can defeat. And they began this war with the slogan of the second strongest army in the world. Now we see it is the second strongest army in Ukraine.
Or is it third or fourth now?
Yeah, after one. And in Russia itself, right? Many people living in their normal countries were following this image of Russia. And perhaps their feelings can be separated into fear of Russia as something difficult to comprehend and really strong to fight against, and some illusion about mystical Russian soul, romantic landscapes and roads and I don't know what not. The reality is different. And they see this reality. I do believe that even those who doubt, they see. You cannot unsee people killed on the streets of Bucha or the remains of Mariupol. That is all very visible, and with internet, it's a blessing in this case. Because when millions were dying during Holodomor, it was easy to close your eyes and not to notice things happening. Now it's impossible, and democratic, humane society cannot unsee and forget that. So perhaps I hope they are starting to accept the fact that Russia is not that strong. Russia is crazy. That's why I totally agree with you. How come an argument that many new countries who will control nukes, do you feel comfortable just with Putin controlling the nukes? It seems to me no. Then there are lots of options, like Budapest Memorandum, but written in a better way.
That worked well, didn't it?
Yeah, perfect. But, now lots of people are mocking Ukraine for signing this Budapest Memorandum, and I do it sometimes myself. But if you look deeper into that, that was a very positive tendency. And if we did not have crazy Russia, we would encourage more countries to follow our example. So it's not Ukraine that is stupid signing it. It's the world who actually decided not to escalate when Russia is bombing Ukrainian territory. I believe our full victory is impossible without the collapse of Russia. The West was afraid of the collapse of Soviet Union. They could not believe it will ever happen. And come on, perhaps Soviet Union was stronger than modern Russia, honestly. We have to finally, and I'm very grateful to the community today that we are bringing this narrative on the discussion on the global stage, because that's important to start constructing. What if Russia collapses? And many new beautiful countries will appear. Russia is not that big. Many peoples are suppressed there. Many stories are untold. Ukrainians managed to attract the support of the world and to share their stories. Many indigenous people, you know how they forbid to study languages, and Udmurt people, it seems to me, I'm afraid to make a mistake, they were burning themselves, one of the linguistic professors, because of this very, once again, manipulative act. Like when you're not obliged to study your language, it can be an additional course and so on. They never forbid something, but we pretty well know how it works. So let's accept the fact that we are already in danger and nukes are already in the hands of crazy monsters. They already travel the world despite all international agreements, and they are in Belarus, though Belarus does not have a nuclear status. So we failed that. So let's better think and support this movement. I hope maybe some national movements exist inside Russia, and many new countries will appear with new perspectives for investment, cultures coming back, diversity, and maybe one day Russia will become normal in a century or what. I remember finishing it all up, one quote of Jerzy Hedroit, who said that Poland will become successful when it forgets its imperial past and ambitions. And look at Poland now. I consider it a successful country.
And Germany and Japan, the same story.
So that is an advice to Russia. And even those who believe in good Russians have to support our vision of future Russian collapse, because that can actually free them from misery, hatred, and the myths that intoxicate them. And actually they are trapped in their own myths and propaganda.
And the shocking thing is that those myths and propaganda propagated in the West and believed. You know, people fear chaos in Russia, but they've already used biological weapons in England. They've already used polonium to wipe out their opponents. The Tarakan in Belarus, Lukashenko, already has nuclear weapons. I mean, the chaos is already here.
Russia is a criminal, totally toxic state, and lying is acceptable everywhere. And I think that many countries just cannot accept the fact that lying is so widespread, and that it's not just for a presidential campaign for a couple of months, but it's forever, and everyone spreads the lies. So people tend to believe, if you're saying that you're so strong, then perhaps. If you're saying that you have 1 million tanks, then maybe. And then, when reality comes...
I would probably add here that something which the West very much denies, but this is here, and the sooner the West realizes and accepts this reality, the easier would be for everybody. But Russia is waging the war against the West already. It is hybrid war at this very moment. But I mean, take a look what they are doing, you know, with the hands of Belarus at the Polish and Lithuanian borders. The way how they are trying, yes, to push immigrants and create this immigration crisis. Take a look what they have been doing for years in the Baltic Sea. All this surveillance and collection of the information about the infrastructure, about the strategic objects, you know. I mean, there was very good investigation conducted by the Scandinavian broadcasters, which proved that 4 days before the blowing up of Nord Stream 2, there were Russian warships there, very close to the site of the explosion. And then, you know, all of a sudden we are seeing, we are reading the news that some yacht with random 4 Ukrainians did this, you know, subversive act, which is an absolutely insane thing, but it is somehow, you know, thrown into the coverage and is being reported. So long story short, even if you take a look at the Russian propaganda mouthpieces, you know, their key argument why they cannot take over Ukraine, which according to them was supposed to meet and greet them, you know, with the bread and salt and flowers as the liberation forces, because they are not fighting against Ukraine, but because they are fighting against NATO. And if you take a look at their narrative, narratives that, you know, one big Eurasia from Vladivostok to Lisbon, I mean, they are very clearly speaking out their ambition to grab as much land as possible. And they feel very brave and courageous regarding Ukraine because let's recall what was the communication of the Western leaders before the beginning of the full-scale war. It was every inch of NATO will be defended and Ukraine will be supported. Ukraine will get some weapons. You remember that there were talks about how to arm insurgents. I mean, you know, because the reality which was accepted back then was that there will be mass, large-scale occupation, which will end up with, I don't know, issuing the grave concerns tweets once per month about very severe violations of human rights in the Russian-occupied Ukraine. But this reality hasn't happened only because of the bravery of the Ukrainian armed forces and the assistance which we are receiving from our international partners. That's very important, and we recognize it, and we are very grateful for it. But we all have to realize, that's what Anna said, and that's what I want to stress, that the reality in which Ukraine is occupied by Russia poses severely big threat to the security of NATO, of entire world order. And that's something which, from my perspective, is not understood by many. And unfortunately, it is still, you know, not understood that in the very long war of attrition, Ukraine may lose, because our mobilization potential is much lower, because our infrastructure is being destroyed and bombed, and without electricity the economy cannot be running, because our ports, which are key for the exports and for our economic potential and for our economic growth, are either occupied or they are bombed and erased from the ground. This is Ukraine which is being killed, destroyed, damaged, not Russia. And when we are reading, you know, tweets, I was in the conference a few months ago where there were many good Russians which emigrated to European countries. They were against the war. And the key message which they communicated was that you cannot follow this news daily because you get depressed, and then you need to drink pills from the depression, and you cannot expect people, you know, to suffer that much. It is absolutely normal that they, you know, kind of closed themselves from the war and try to live the life as if this war is not existing, because they cannot change anything. So their choice is to just not traumatize themselves. If ordinary Russians would not be traumatized by this war, then Ukraine will be destroyed fully and Russia would be absolutely fine. And this is something which many partners do not understand, because let's impose sanctions, but they should not, you know, have the impact on poor Russians, because they will suffer. We cannot ban visas Russian, because tourists have nothing to do. This is Putin's war. And this regards very many things. How to punish Putin, but not punishing, not even punishing. How to make sure that ordinary Russians do not suffer from the consequences of this war. And then let's wait and until Russians stop Putin and stop this war. This is surrealism.
This is difficult to understand because Westerners imposed their own frameworks onto the situation. In this situation, I would do X, Y, and Z. I would oppose the government. I'd do this, I'd do that, I'd come on the streets, I'd exert my rights. Believe me, the lesson from the 90s is the Russians will not rebel against their leaders until the last sausage has been eaten, until the last chunk of cheese is gone, until the last slice of bread has gone, and there's no more beer in the fridge. That's the only point at which they might start thinking about rebelling.
I agree, and that was so perfectly said, because we see this with the when you see the Ukrainian athletes meeting the Russians and the poor Russian, oh, you wouldn't shake my hand, and Russia is the school shooter of nations. Everything's terrible. I'm going to blow everyone else up, and we really have to realize this in the West. And I think, but this is where in the West we need to understand our own sense of agency, because we are increasingly, people in Western democracies feel sort of helpless. So they actually kind of sympathize with the Russians, because they're like, oh, well, I'm frustrated with my government. So what the story that is missed is like the wild, radical, bold story of Ukrainians, the Maidan, the people who, like, the government here knows that they push you too far, and I saw this in the pandemic, you'll have a Maidan. And so I think we need to update our kind of political theory from John Locke. We need a fourth branch of government. It's the Maidan. And to really show, Ukrainians show the people this sense of agency. And as an example of that, and one of my missions now is to get more and more Ukrainians and Americans to cooperate in very creative ways. And so I invited here a few, for example, my friend Mikhailo, the great Ukrainian artist, Nevan made. He's made some of the most iconic posters of the war, famous posters of the atrocities in Mariupol and Odessa. He's here with his wife Laura, and he uses his art to raise money to buy drones and all kinds of stuff, especially for Azov. So the current fundraiser is this poster. This is from Mikhailo. This was the attack on Odessa. When you were there painting this while a missile hit 1 block away from you. And right now, so there's a fundraiser where whoever gives the most money for this current fundraiser for Azov will get this poster. Hopefully this will end up in some American dining room in Beverly Hills where their neighbors will come over and say, I want that too, and then they start giving support for Ukraine. And also, by the way, great t-shirt I was wearing earlier of the heroes of Mariupol, also made by Nevan Mikhailo. And here's where you see, if we can start to get more and more Ukrainian artists and musicians, everyone's doing their own projects, but to get more and more people to unite, both while we wait and work for fighter jets to supply every one of our friends at the front line with everything they need, but also to collaborate on the information war. Also, we have here my friend Oles Derega, another great Ukrainian artist who's designed patches for soldiers, and he auctions off his art to support the cause. My friend Vlodia Caballo, who has long worked for the Council of Europe, now works with the United Nations, but is an important Ukrainian voice there and has worked on deregulation and making government more local, which is a story that would really resonate with the West. But that story does not get told enough. Again, I mentioned Rich with the Frontline Kitchen, Taras with his local media, the Tvoye Misto, and all the work they've done to educate foreign journalists. And then in the back, my friends from a Lviv IT company, Deep Inspire Foundation. Well, Deep Inspire was their company. When the full-scale invasion started, they made it their mission to get trucks and drones and night scopes and everything. Sometimes, if it had to come through the Carpathian Woods, whatever it took to get the Ukrainian soldiers what they need. We work with them every week to try to buy supplies and get them delivered to the front. And it is all these little groups of people connecting and collaborating with each other. And so that's both a mechanism to get to victory. Oh, I got to mention my friend Rob, by the way, American paratrooper and Special Forces veteran, served in Iraq and many places. He was living in Lviv in the pandemic. He's also a chef, and he wanted to open a restaurant here. And when the full-scale invasion started, he immediately began to house refugees from all over Ukraine and would cook them amazing meals for volunteers and refugees. We also brought American Ukraine skeptics secretly here to try to convince them, or at least get them to shut up. And Rob's Meals helps with that process. And now he's working on buying drones. And then we have Lindsay and Stephen from the United States. Stephen, a great, brilliant programmer and software engineer. More than that, really. I'm not good at describing these terms, but we start to bring the best of the best here to help every single day. And so this is both a mechanism for victory, but also the more we can share this story, people will say, wait a second, all the best and brightest are coming here. Maybe we need to start supporting Ukraine. Because it's not just the governments. We got to get the regular people behind us.
Now, we're almost at time, so I'm going to jump in. I'm going to leave off where you mentioned victory twice. And we've just got like 2 minutes to go on this panel. What I wanted to do is just go through a quick list of what victory means for all of us. So if you can just sort of launch off the last person, add some more, because there are many aspects to victory. It's not just victory on the battlefield. It's not just regaining the territorial borders of 1991. There are so many ways in which victory is defined and will not be fully achieved. But let's run through those. Let's start with Anna, and then if you can list 2 or 3, each of your top concepts of what victory entails.
Okay, I'll start.
Oh,
Definitely liberation of entire territory, that's must. Justice, accountability, not only for the war crimes, but for the mother of all crimes, which is act of aggression. So regarding Putin, Lavrov, and all those who are right now untouchables according to the international law, these are reparations, so Russia has to pay for the recovery of Ukraine and for all of the damages and for all of the losses. Some are absolutely unrepairable, but anyway, that has to be done. And Ukraine's membership in EU and NATO as the security guarantee that this won't repeat when Russia rearms, gets more weapons, and the bringing back of our people that are kidnapped in Russia.
Anna.
So I will continue because I totally agree with everything that Olena has enumerated, and that's the real victory. But of course the collapse of Russia that we discussed and many beautiful democratic states appearing. And one emotional thing, I have many favorite writers who were killed in 1930s. And very often when I think about this period in Ukraine, Holodomor and other things, Stalin's terror, I imagine how different our country would have been if this didn't happen. How many beautiful, extremely modern, adventurous, rebellious people would be developing Ukraine. So the victory will be that many, many, many really talented people will remain in Ukraine, will survive in Ukraine, and will continue building our country. One of the arguments that work really well with those who doubt, Ukraine can easily and successfully live without Russia. Russian Empire cannot imagine itself without. So our true victory is our forever independence and the ability to develop the country the way we want. And I'm extremely optimistic about Ukrainian civil society. Russia is definitely the mother of corruption, and all that we have is that Soviet heritage that we will definitely sweep away. So this development of Ukrainian civil society, collapse of Russia, we can start to launch some campaigns, teach them how to live, but in a couple of decades, not earlier.
Joe, you've got 1 minute before arrest comes and chases us all off.
Fantastic.
The stage. Yeah.
For Darina, Group 35, amazing group. They buy a lot of trucks. Sorry, I missed you. Victory must mean, because in order for victory, we do need the support of the West. So victory must mean an idea and a change of heart. And it must mean that people all over the world, regular people who choose their governments, believe that they can choose their governments, believe they have agency, and believe in freedom. And if people around the world can find this within their own hearts, Ukrainian victory is possible, because they will then be able to support us against the tyrants. Ukrainians will never give up. I was just in a Kryvka the other day in the Carpathian Mountains. But for quick and swift and complete victory soon, we need chains of hearts of people around the world. And people need to follow if they can follow the Ukrainian model, which means we need to share that story with them, then victory will happen. That's the key, to change minds and hearts, to get people to believe in Maidan everywhere, including New York, London, Beijing, all around the world. That's the goal.
Thank you so much to the 3 panelists, Joe, Olena, Anna. The crucial thing is to get this message out here. So we're going to have the live Q&A session after a short break. Can you please forward the link to the channel, to the live stream that's already queued up, we'll be kicking off. We want to get a huge online audience, and then we want to get a huge audience for when this panel's published up next week. And we want to make sure as many people listen to it, and we want those people to write to their congressmen, write to their MPs, not just consume this information and wring their hands and go, this is terrible, but what can I do? Ukrainians teach us there is tons we can do, and we need to put pressure on our politicians and decision makers and make them understand that this is critical, not just for Ukrainian survival and freedom, but for our own way of life, our own systems, our own institutions.